In the quiet town of Maplewood, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were hard to keep, Dr. Julia Morgan was a respected figure. A skilled physician with a thriving practice, she was known for her compassion, dedication, and the calm demeanor she brought into every patient's room. But beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life, Julia was hiding a web of deceit that would eventually lead to a shocking murder that no one saw coming. This is the story of how a respected doctor's secret life of infidelity with her patients unraveled, leading to a tragic end that shook the entire community. Julia Morgan appeared to have it all. A successful medical practice, a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, and a loving husband, Tom Morgan, who had always been her biggest supporter. Tom, a high school history teacher, was proud of his wife's accomplishments and often bragged about her to his colleagues and friends. To everyone who knew them, Julia and Tom seemed to be the perfect couple, intelligent, kind, and deeply in love. Their relationship had begun during their college years, where Julia had been pursuing a degree in medicine and Tom had been studying education. They were the couple that everyone admired, with Tom's easygoing nature complementing Julia's driven and ambitious personality. After graduation, they moved to Maplewood, where Julia established her medical practice, and Tom began teaching at the local high school. Over the years, they built a life together that seemed unshakable, filled with mutual respect, love, and shared dreams. But as the years passed, Julia's life as a doctor became more demanding. The long hours, the stress of managing her practice, and the emotional toll of dealing with sick patients began to weigh on her. Tom noticed the change in his wife, but he chalked it up to the pressures of her career. He tried to support her as best he could, taking on more responsibilities at home and encouraging her to take time for herself. However, what Tom didn't know was that Julia's growing restlessness wasn't just due to the pressures of her job. Something far more sinister was brewing beneath the surface. Something that would eventually tear their lives apart. It began innocently enough. Julia had always been empathetic towards her patients, often going above and beyond to make them feel comfortable and cared for. But there was one patient who stood out, Mark, a successful businessman who had been coming to see Julia for regular checkups. Mark was charming, confident, and attentive in a way that Julia found herself drawn to. At first, their interactions were strictly professional. But over time, a flirtatious rapport developed between them. Mark would make casual remarks about how beautiful Julia looked, or how lucky her husband must be to have her. Julia, flattered by the attention, found herself looking forward to Mark's appointments more than she should have. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Mark asked Julia if she would like to grab a drink with him to unwind. It was an innocent enough suggestion, but Julia knew that it crossed a line. Still, she agreed, convincing herself that it was just a friendly outing. They went to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, where they talked for hours about life, work, and everything in between. As the night wore on, the conversation took a more personal turn. Mark confided in Julia about the struggles in his own marriage, and Julia found herself opening up about her own feelings of dissatisfaction and loneliness. They both knew that they were treading dangerous territory, but neither of them seemed willing to pull back. One drink turned into two, and before Julia knew it, they were sharing a passionate kiss in the dimly lit corner of the bar. It was a moment of weakness, a fleeting lapse in judgment, but it was also the beginning of something much darker. The affair with Mark became a regular occurrence, with secret meetings and late-night rendezvous becoming a part of Julia's routine. Julia told herself that it was just a fling, something to help her escape the pressures of her life. But deep down, she knew that she was playing with fire. As Julia's affair with Mark continued, she found herself drawn to the thrill of the forbidden, the secrecy, the lies, the excitement of being with someone other than her husband. It all became an addictive escape from the monotony of her everyday life. But Mark wasn't the only patient who caught Julia's eye. She found herself in similar entanglements with other patients. There was David, a young lawyer who was dealing with the stress of a high-profile case. He came to Julia for stress management and anxiety treatment, but their sessions quickly turned into something much more personal. David was vulnerable and in need of comfort, and Julia was more than willing to provide it. Then there was James, a widower who had been struggling with depression after the death of his wife. Julia had always had a soft spot for James, and their professional relationship gradually evolved into an emotional affair. James was grateful for the attention and care that Julia showed him, and he began to rely on her not just as his doctor, but as a confidant and friend. 2 more patients followed: Michael, an artist with a troubled past, and Richard, a former soldier dealing with PTSD. Each of them found solace in Julia, and each of them became entangled in her web of deceit. To Julia, these affairs were a way to cope with her own unhappiness, a way to feel desired and needed in a way that her marriage no longer provided. But the more affairs she had, the more complicated her life became. Julia was constantly juggling lies, sneaking around, and living in fear of being caught. She knew that what she was doing was wrong. But the thrill of the secret relationships was too intoxicating to give up. Meanwhile, Tom was beginning to notice changes in his wife that he couldn't ignore. Julia was often distant, distracted, and irritable. She spent more time at the office, and when she was home, she was always on her phone, texting or checking messages. Tom tried to talk to her about it, but Julia brushed off his concerns, insisting that she was just stressed from work. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started paying more attention to Julia's behavior, noticing the way she would smile at her phone or the way she seemed to be lost in thought more often than not. He even began to wonder if there was someone else in her life, but he pushed the thought aside, not wanting to believe that his beloved wife could be unfaithful. One day, Tom decided to surprise Julia by bringing her lunch at the office. He knew she had been working long hours and thought it would be a nice gesture, but when he arrived at the clinic, he was told that Julia was out to lunch with a patient. Tom felt a pang of jealousy, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He waited in her office for her to return, but when Julia walked in, she was visibly startled to see him. "Tom, what are you doing here?" Julia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch," Tom replied, trying to keep his tone light. "But I see you already have plans." Julia quickly recovered from her initial shock and forced a smile. "Oh, it was just a last-minute thing. A patient was having a tough day, and I thought it would be good to talk over lunch, but I'd love to have lunch with you too. Let's go." As they sat down to eat, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that Julia was hiding something from him. He tried to engage her in conversation, but she was distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. Tom knew that he needed to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. But he didn't want to confront Julia without more evidence. He decided to give it more time, hoping that she would come to him and tell him the truth. But Julia had no intention of confessing. She was too deep into her affairs, too consumed by the lies she had been telling. And as time went on, the strain on her marriage grew, pushing her and Tom further apart. The breaking point came one evening when Tom received an anonymous letter in the mail. The letter contained no return address, just a single piece of paper with a typed message. "Your wife is cheating on you with multiple patients." Tom's heart sank as he read the words. He had always feared that Julia might be unfaithful, but seeing it in black and white was like a punch to the gut. He sat down, trying to process the information, but his mind was racing. Who had sent the letter? Was it true? And if so, how long had this been going on? Tom knew he couldn't ignore the letter. He decided to confront Julia that evening, hoping that she would deny the accusations and put his mind at ease. But when he showed her the letter, Julia's reaction was not what he had expected. She paled, her eyes widening in shock as she read the note. "Tom, I don't know who sent this, but it's not true," she stammered. But Tom could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she held the letter. He knew then that the letter was telling the truth. His wife had been cheating on him, and the realization shattered him. "How long, Julia?" Tom asked, his voice breaking. "How long have you been lying to me?" Julia tried to deny it, but the weight of her guilt was too much to bear. She could see the hurt in Tom's eyes, the betrayal written all over his face. Her defenses crumbled and she broke down, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Tom," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." Tom felt his world collapsing around him. The woman he had loved and trusted for so many years had been living a double life, hiding her affairs with patience behind the facade of a loving wife. The pain was unbearable, and he didn't know how to respond. He felt a surge of anger and sadness all at once. But most of all, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss of the life he thought he had, loss of the future he had envisioned with Julia. "Why, Julia?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you do this? Wasn't I enough for you?" Julia couldn't meet his gaze. She couldn't explain the reasons behind her actions because even she didn't fully understand them. The thrill of the affairs, the escape from her own unhappiness, the need to feel desired. It had all driven her to make choices she now deeply regretted. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you. I've made so many mistakes and I wish I could take it all back." But Tom couldn't find it in himself to forgive her. Not in that moment. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Julia alone with her guilt and shame. In the days that followed, Tom's pain turned to anger. He couldn't stop thinking about the letter, the affairs, and the lies Julia had told him. His trust in her was shattered, and he felt like a fool for not seeing the signs earlier. The love he had once felt for her was now tainted by the bitterness of betrayal. Julia, too, was spiraling. She tried to reach out to Tom to mend the rift between them, but he had shut her out completely. The silence between them was deafening, and Julia felt like she was drowning in her own guilt. Her affairs had given her a temporary escape from her problems. But now she was facing the consequences of her actions, and the weight of it was crushing her. The patients with whom she had been involved began to distance themselves, sensing that something had changed in Julia. The excitement and allure that had once drawn them to her were gone, replaced by a sense of unease and tension. Julia's practice began to suffer as a result, with patients canceling appointments and rumors spreading about her unprofessional behavior. As her life continued to unravel, Julia found herself feeling more isolated than ever. The affairs that had once brought her excitement and fulfillment now seemed hollow and meaningless. She had lost everything that mattered to her, her marriage, her career, and the respect of the community. And with each passing day, the guilt and regret grew stronger, gnawing at her from the inside out. Tom's anger and resentment festered over time, consuming him from the inside. He couldn't let go of the betrayal, couldn't find a way to move past the pain. The love he once felt for Julia had turned into something dark and twisted, a poisonous mix of rage and heartbreak that he couldn't escape. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights and obsessive thoughts, Tom reached his breaking point. He couldn't bear the thought of living in the same house with Julia any longer, but he also couldn't bring himself to leave. He felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to find a way out. In a fit of desperation, Tom decided to confront Julia one last time. He needed answers, needed to understand why she had done what she did. He stormed into their bedroom, where Julia was sitting on the edge of the bed, lost in her own thoughts. "Why, Julia?" Tom demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "Why did you do this to us? To me? I gave you everything and this is how you repay me?" Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said softly. "I don't know what else to say. I've made so many mistakes, and I can't change what I've done." But her apology only fueled Tom's rage. He couldn't accept that she had thrown away their life together for meaningless affairs with her patients. In his mind, she had destroyed everything they had built, and he couldn't forgive her for it. In that moment, something snapped inside Tom. He felt a surge of anger so intense that it overwhelmed his senses, clouding his judgment. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight from Julia's desk, and hurled it at her in a blind rage. The paperweight struck Julia on the side of her head with a sickening thud, and she collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around her. Tom stood there, frozen in shock, as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. The anger that had consumed him only moments before was now replaced by a cold, numbing fear. He dropped to his knees beside Julia, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. The blow had been fatal, and Julia was already gone. Tom's hands were stained with her blood, and he knew that there was no undoing what he had done. Tom's life, already in ruins, was completely shattered after Julia's death. The authorities were called, and he was arrested at the scene, still in shock and covered in his wife's blood. He confessed to the murder, unable to comprehend how his life had spiraled so out of control. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with the once respected doctor's affairs and the shocking murder dominating the headlines. The small town of Maplewood was rocked by the scandal, and the community that had once admired Tom and Julia now looked on them with pity and disdain. During the trial, Tom's defense argued that he had been driven to a breaking point by Julia's infidelity and the psychological torment he had endured as a result. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a man who had allowed his anger and jealousy to consume him, leading him to commit a brutal and senseless murder. In the end, Tom was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The once promising teacher, known for his kindness and dedication, was now a broken man, haunted by the memories of what he had done. In prison, he spent his days reflecting on his actions, tormented by the knowledge that he had taken the life of the woman he had once loved more than anything. As for Julia, her death was a tragic end to a life that had been filled with potential. She had been a talented doctor, a respected member of the community, and a loving wife, at least on the surface. But her choices had led her down a dark path, one that ultimately cost her everything. The story of Tom and Julia Morgan is a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception, infidelity, and unchecked emotions. It's a reminder that the choices we make can have far-reaching consequences, and that the secrets we keep can destroy not only our own lives, but the lives of those we love. For the town of Maplewood, the scandal and tragedy left a lasting mark. The community was forced to confront the darker side of human nature, and the story of Tom and Julia became a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the destructive power of lies. In the end, there are no winners in this story, only broken lives, shattered dreams, and the haunting memory of what could have been. But perhaps in telling their story, others can learn from their mistakes and find a way to avoid the same tragic fate. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.